Welcome, listeners and watchers, young and old, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to YALLWrite, this year's edition of YALLFest, now broadcast all over the place instead of being localized in Charleston, South Carolina. Hopefully, this is the one and only year we won't be able to be with you in person. But I'm lucky to be here as your moderator. I'm Soman, author of This Book for Good and Evil, and I'm here to moderate an absolutely amazing group of authors who specialize in fantasy and astonishing adventures. And we're here to talk to them about how they do what they do and why they do what they do. So I'm going to introduce them to you now, and then we'll get started. So we have the amazing John August. We have Kwame Mbalia. We have Claribel Ortega. And we have Sayantani DasGupta. And we're going to start just so viewers can get a little more familiar with all you guys, with each of you telling us a little bit about yourself, maybe where you're from, and also about your latest book, so kids can know what to look out for from each of you. So John, why don't we start with you, since you're on the top of my screen?
Absolutely. My name is John August. The books I write are Arlo Finch in the Valley of Fire, and it's a 3-book series. They're set in Colorado, which is where I grew up. I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, spent all my childhood there, moved away, and then, of course, like most adults, realized, oh, that place I grew up was actually kind of fascinating and great. So I was able to write books set back in that world. Most of my writing has been as a screenwriter. So I write features. I did Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and other sort of big adventure stories for the screen. But it was really amazing to get a chance to go back and write the kind of book I wanted to read when I was a kid. I'd never read a book set in Colorado that wasn't about sort of covered wagons and miners. And so that's something present day in Colorado was exciting for me. And also it's something that felt like the kinds of books I wanted to read back then. I was at that age, I was reading, Lord of the Rings and the Narnia books. So it was a chance to combine the things I loved most about that age and writing some books about them.
Awesome. Sayantani, you're next.
So I'm Sayantani DasGupta. I'm the author of the Kiranmala and the Kingdom Beyond series, which is a Bengali folktale and string theory inspired series, because why not? The latest in the trilogy is called The Chaos Curse. So this is the 3rd book in the trilogy, and it follows the continued adventures of Kiranmala, who thinks she's just an ordinary Indian immigrant daughter from New Jersey, and that all of her parents' stories about her being an intergalactic princess are just that, stories, until she realizes that they may be real, and she has to travel across the dimensions and find out more about herself and rescue her parents, and in this book, rescue some new friends, and realize that she actually has to save all the diverse stories to make sure that the universe keeps on expanding. So that's The Chaos Curse.
Fantastic. Claribel, you're up next.
Sure. So my name is Claribel Ortega. This is my debut book, Ghost Squad. It came out this year in April, and it's based on Dominican folklore that says fireflies are the souls of your lost loved ones who are watching over you. And it stars Lucely Luna and her best friend Sid and a fat cat named Chunk. They accidentally unleash evil spirits on the city of St. Augustine, and then they have to find a way to send them back into the underworld before the full moon on Halloween. So it's a very adventure, like in the vein of Goonies, but with, brown and black kids at the helm on bikes, just like going through the town having adventures. It's really, really fun. And I also host 2 podcasts. So I do that when I'm not writing, in the very few short hours of free time that I have.
And I'm pretty sure John hosts a podcast also, so we're going to have to hear about that too. Kwame, you're up next.
Hey, my name is Kwame Mbalia. I am the author of Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, and the sequel that just came out this October, Tristan Strong Destroys the World. And I'm here in North Carolina, and I just turned in the 3rd and final book in the trilogy, the as yet untitled Tristan Strong Book 3. Thank you very much. So I am celebrating by doing absolutely well. No, I'm still writing, but I don't have a deadline as of yet. And I just got a PS5, so it's, you know, I don't foresee any deadlines in the future.
I thought maybe we'd start and talk about where your love of fantasy came from. So maybe starting from, because I know a lot of people watching are obviously fantasy lovers, and usually there's something that activates your love of the genre. Like for me, it was actually the Oz books, the Wizard of Oz books, because they felt so deep and fully realized. So maybe one of you wants to jump in and tell us what first got you thinking that big.
I'll say that for me, I was more of like, I read a lot of scary books growing up. I was more like the spooky book kid until an English teacher gave me The Hobbit freshman year of high school. And I became obsessed with all things Lord of the Rings. And I just read all the books. And it was right before like the movies came out. So that just intensified my obsession. But that was really the first thing. Like I read a couple of fantasy books before that, but nothing really like triggered my love for it, like reading The Hobbit. And I think I read it in like one sitting. It's a pretty short book. But after that, it's just like, I couldn't get enough. Like, I was like, okay, do you have any more of these books? To my English teacher. And that was me like every single week. But yeah, that was probably the first one, and I haven't looked back since.
Sayantani, how about you?
So super similar story, although Claribel, when I was reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the movies weren't just about to come out. They came out many years later. Big Tolkien fan. I'm also a really big Madeleine L'Engle fan. Like that was the first time I really realized that science and wonder can exist alongside kind of a cracking good story about family and adventure and finding yourself. And Soman, you just reminded me how much I love the Oz books as well. Ozma of Oz was like a huge favorite. And then alongside those, that was also the era that, you know, I was in first grade when the first Star Wars came out, when the first, you know, which is now the fourth, came out. And I remember I was too young to read the words going across the screen, and someone had to read it to me. But I was hooked. Like I was hooked on Star Wars and then Star Trek and the old Buck Rogers and the old Battlestar Galactica. And I just, you know, couldn't get enough of those stories, but I never saw somebody who looked like me in any of those stories, and really longed to. And so, you know, Toni Morrison has that expression, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written yet, you must write it. So I kind of followed her advice and wrote the book I wish I'd had back then.
How about you, Kwame?
I think we are going to have similar stories. And for me, there are specific events that are kind of, I tether to those stories or whatever, and that's what kind of keeps them fresh in my memory. So, for example, I read The Lord of the Rings really, really, really early, and we had the compendium, like it was all in one book, all three books, you know, The Fellowship of the Ring, all the way through The Two Towers and Return of the King, were all in one giant book, and that was important because I could use that to submit to a contest where, you know, you however many pages you read, you could win a prize or whatever. And so, of course, nobody read as many pages as me because I read the Lord of the Rings compendium, and I won 2 tickets to see the Bucks and the Bulls play. And I also remember reading a lot of, I used to love C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. And I remember getting in trouble because I read The Horse and His Boy, I think it was in like 3rd or 4th grade in class. Like I had it underneath my desk, like right here, and I was just reading it. And I thought I was being slick, you know, but you know, if you can't be slick if you like lick your finger and then turn the page. Like there's nothing sneaky about it. You know, there's nothing sneaky about that. And then finally, I fell in love with A Wizard of Earthsea, and that by Ursula Le Guin, and that was It just absolutely just captured my imagination. And so all of these just, secondary world fantasies, just with wizards and magic and all sorts of different transformations, it just really swept me up and allowed me to kind of, escape from the day-to-day humdrum that I felt my life was. My life was really boring, so I had to escape.
And John, how about you? I mean, you're also responsible for writing some big fantasy movies that people, like kids all around the world, have seen. So was there a difference between sort of your inspiration on the book front and on the movie front?
Like everybody, I grew up reading those same books. Like I recognized, checked, read all those things at the same time. And I think I didn't understand at that point the difference between sort of like pure fantasy, like Tolkien, where it's just like it's a completely different world, or Star Wars, where it's a completely different world, versus some of the things like Narnia, which is like portal fiction, where you start in a real world and you cross over. And I think I always identified so strong with portal fiction because I kind of wanted to be there with them doing this. I wanted to believe that I could be the kind of kid who like crossed over to this thing and had to learn stuff. Even The Wizard of Oz is essentially portal fiction. You're stepping into this other world and seeing stuff. And so most of the movies I've written end up being some version of a character starts in a normal world and has to move into this fantasy world and learn how it all works and then sort of merge at the end. Even Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is that. Corpse Bride is that. There's stories where, the central question and conflict is how am I going to survive in this new world I've entered into? And so I forgot to hold up my book. I was a bad author. I forgot to hold up my book at the start. I have the same cover artist as Sayantani. We have Vivian Toe did both my book.
Oh, nice.
Oh, cool.
Cover siblings. And one of the reasons why I really wanted to write a book was to explore what it's like if you sort of you keep walking back and forth between that portal, where like, what if you have a kid who gets to sleep in his own bed every night and still having the kind of fantasy adventures where they're not always in the other world. And so a book was just a great chance to experiment with that and sort of see what that felt like.
It's funny because I actually think this is a super fundamental difference between writers, is fantasy writers, whether you're a portal fiction person or whether you're a create your own world a la Star Wars person. I can only write portal fiction. I'm just like John, like, unless I start in the real world, a fantasy world often has no meaning to me, which is sacrilege to a lot of people. The only reason I could enjoy Game of Thrones was because it seemed like our world. So I'm curious, the rest of you, what's your stance to portal fiction versus a completely new immersive universe, since we're on the subject, and I'm curious. Sayantani, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I actually have a thought. And I usually say this when people ask me why I'm so interested in string theory and kind of multiverse theory. But John, I think your comments about portal fiction actually just made me realize something about my own writing, which is I think that portal fiction for me works in the same way that multiverse theory or string theory works, which is that it's a really good way for me, at least as a writer, to explore being an immigrant daughter and kind of being a part of a diaspora where my character, like me, has access to multiple worlds and gets to move back and forth across them. And not everyone has access to those worlds, but she does because she's an immigrant daughter. And so I usually explain this when I talk about why, there's string theory in my books, which is this idea that there's multiple universes, multiverses that exist like guitars on a string next to each other, vibrating, but never kind of aware of each other's presence. And I often say like, immigrant families or diasporic families, we're the ones who get to hop across multiverses, like we're space travelers. And I realized, I'm like, maybe that's why I write portal fantasy, because it actually is it's the same principle. It's that, my heroine, like me, was somebody who got to hop back and forth between worlds. And those worlds were extremely different and they demanded different things of you, but they also taught you different things about yourself. So thank you, John, for that insight.
No, thank you for that insight. That's that feels very, very true. Because there's one thing when I read a book like Dune, where like you're presented with here's the whole world and here's how the whole world works. It's great and it's exciting, but you end up spending so much time establishing the rules of that world, versus when we write portal fantasy, you sort of get the real world kind of for free. You're establishing normal things, and then we're traveling into that new world with our characters. So stuff can be taught to us at the same time it's being taught to this character, and learning about stuff. And you can avoid the as we all know kind of things that happen so often when you're trying to establish the rules of a new world.
Let me pivot to something else, because we're starting to get a ton of questions in from viewers. And Kwame and Claribel, they are curious. How do you create an immersive atmosphere for young readers? Like, what are the steps to building a world? Is it something where, you know, you outline it ahead of time, you're making maps, you just start writing and see where it goes? How do you create something that's coherent and imaginative in terms of world building?
I don't know what do you say, outlining?
Oh, like there's a fascinating yourself.
What is that? I don't know her. Sorry to just jump out there, Claribel, but for me, I don't. So I've tried to outline. I've tried, and what happens to me is that I get bored. Right? It's if I know what's going to happen in the story, it's like I have to read it twice, because then I have to write it again, and I already know what's going to happen. I kind of like letting the story unfold as I'm writing it. And what has to happen then is I just have to be diligent with revisions and making sure everything is neat and it doesn't look like I've just, zigzagged all over the place with the story, as was the case while writing it. But to create an immersive world, the thing that's really important for me, at least, is to make sure that I'm engaging all the senses. So what are you what is the character hearing? What are they smelling? What are they what do they see? Can they see? What do they feel? I think my favorite thing that kind of encapsulates that I specifically remember, am I engaging all five senses in this chapter, is in the first book, and Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky. When he first falls through the hole in the sky and lands in the burning sea, the sea is warm, it's uncomfortable, he sees that it's on fire, he hears these faint haunting sounds that turns out to be the bone chips, and the seawater tastes like old hot dog water. And so you really get to engage all of your senses, and you kind of, you hear hot dog water, and you immediately get that weird taste in your mouth, and you're like, oh, and that's the reaction I'm looking for. That's how I know that it's being immersive, is when the readers are starting to react the way that the character reacts.
I also don't know her in terms of outlining. I don't outline. I have a very chaotic writing sort of routine, and then I revise a lot and suffer during that process. But for me, I do a lot of the same things that Kwame does in terms of the senses, but for me, what I try to do is make characters that sort of pull the readers in and makes them want to spend time with them. Like I like making the kind of characters that will, like, the perfect best friend, like Sid is the best friend that I would want to have as a kid. So I made sure to flesh her out in a way that made kids want to be next to her and read about her. Same with Lucelli for a main character, and Babette, who's a grandma and a witch, which is amazing. And I grew up with a lot of the magic things that I put in the book, and the superstitions are part of my culture. So my upbringing kind of felt magical, and just by sharing those things in my writing, I feel almost like it fleshes the world out, because that was my reality. So I just sort of share that with kids, sort of like you were saying before, Sayantani. But yeah, that's pretty much what I do. But outlining, no.
Okay. Meanwhile, we're getting so many questions I can't even begin to keep up. But one of them is from Kunal, who sounds like one of me and Sayantani's people. And he's asking, all of us have written books that are specific to our personal backgrounds, and that's true. I think we are the most culturally diverse set of people I've ever seen in my life. And he wants to know, how do we mine our culture, our backgrounds, our personal experiences to tell a specific story, but that is also universal. So how do you create something that is unique to you and maybe your cultural background, but also everybody can read? Claribel, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, going off a little bit of what I was saying before, I sort of just share the things that I grew up with. Like, for example, my parents grew up in Dominican Republic, and one of the things that they would say is witches would walk across the roof of their houses in the country because they're made out of zinc. They're like metal roofs, so you would hear their footsteps at night. And I always thought that was so creepy. And that's something that sounds like it's right out of a book, but it's something that like you grow up the scary stories you grow up telling each other. And I feel like just sharing those things is enough to make that human connection because those stories come from someplace. They're usually telling some sort of lesson. They come from our ancestors. They're a warning or they're a tool for dealing with different things in life, like the fireflies in Ghost Squad are a tool to deal with grief, right? If you lose somebody, you can say, well, there's fireflies all around me. Those are the people that I lost. I didn't actually lose them. They're watching over me. And I think we all long for those things, and those things are long standing and they've lasted a long time from days of old because they're useful to us as human beings. And I think it's important to keep those stories going. And so for me, that's really what I pull from most, like mythology and like the superstitions and like the old stories from my ancestors, because I feel like they're really helpful and they're something that just touch any human, no matter where you're from.
Let me get Sayantani to weigh in on this, and then I'm going to ask Kwame and John a slightly different variation on this question that somebody is asking. Sayantani, what would you say to this?
Well, I really... Go ahead, someone.
Oh, what would you say to this idea of making something specific to your cultural background, but also universal?
I mean, I actually think the more specific you get as a storyteller, the more universal the story becomes. And I think it has to do with Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's idea of kind of stories being windows into another person's experience and also mirrors that reflect us back to ourselves. For me, it actually took a long time for me to give myself permission to tap into my own personal cultural stories and be as authentic, for lack of a better word, it's a problematic word, as authentic as I could, being a diasporic daughter who grew up here, whose experience is kind of here and there and mixed. But it took me a long time to give myself permission to tell those stories because all my life I'd kind of known there was one set of stories that was, were okay to tell. And I'd never seen Bengali folklore in stories that I'd read in English, in this country. And so it took me a long time to kind of say, you know what, these are the stories that have fed my imagination, kind of like Claribel was saying. These are the stories that make me strong. And I'm going to give myself permission to tell 12-year-old me this story, but in so doing, be as specific as I can to the experience, and then hopefully it becomes very universal because it's so true, right?
Mm. John and Kwame, I'm interested because both your books in the title have your main character, right? So I'm curious how your main character maybe reflects parts of your own experience or parts of your own personality. What did you dig out of yourselves to create Tristan and Arlo?
Well, from Arlo Finch, I think I sort of always knew about the kind of the world of Arlo Finch. I knew at some point I would do something that are set in that universe, but I didn't have that central character. And it was finally giving myself permission to sort of put my younger self as that central character. So my original last name is Meise, which would be Meise in German, which is a small little bird. It's a finch. And so I just took the English word for that. And so he literally is sort of me in that space. And he's me in the sense that I was in Scouts, I was running around in the mountains doing all that stuff. But I was never like the guy in charge. I was never the leader. I was a pretty good follower. And usually in fiction, in sort of middle grade fiction, you expect the kid to actually be driving story and sort of be, pushing things along. And I wanted it to be more like, no, I'm happy to stand back and sort of watch other people do it. And so it's giving myself permission to be that guy in the story who is, his name is the title of the book. But he's not the guy who you would obviously point to as being is the guy who should be driving a story.
Awesome. Kwame, how about you? Where did Tristan come from?
So for me, we kind of mentioned this in that, the more the more detailed you get within the character, within the story, the more relatable, right? Sayantani, you mentioned that. And so for me, when I was looking for, flaws or character traits that, kind of inhibited, obstacles for Tristan to overcome, the biggest one, of course, is grief. Tristan dealing with, the death of his best friend that happened earlier before the book even starts. I had lost my father about 6 months before I started writing this book. So it was really it was really easy to kind of tap into what emotions, how do they randomly strike, when you're thinking of something or something reminds you of that person that you lost. But the other thing is that Tristan, the easiest way for them to get around this world of Alki and across the Burning Sea is to fly. And I was just, I don't like flying. I don't like heights. I do it because it's easy, and convenient to, hop from here to Charleston, to go eat some, banana pudding at YALLFest, right? But I don't like heights. I don't like flying or airplanes. I don't like getting on ladders. I don't like stairs. And so it was easy for me to kind of pluck that and to put that into Tristan's, character, so that when he's on, the raft or when he's on the Shadow Crow of High John, that he's really, he's like, what, I'm just going to close my eyes and pray and hope that this is over.
I'm going to jump to a completely different topic that is my question, because I'm actually really curious about this, which is that often in fantasy, you have to think about whether you're going to write a story that reflects the real world as it is, like sort of a parallel universe that reflects the real world as it is, or as you wish it should be, sort of wish fulfillment. Do you guys skew one way or the other in terms of using fantasy to reflect the sort of realities of our world, or is it more wish fulfillment for you?
I would say wish fulfillment, but I don't even want to call it wish fulfillment. I would just say this was the world as it should be if people pulled their heads out of their pants.
Fair enough. How about any of you have a
probably some wish fulfillment for me too, in the sense of like this, the Rangers, who are the scouts of my story, they're optimized and idealized in ways like somehow these kids are able to sort of do everything by themselves, and there's no adult supervision, which was kind of my experience, growing up in the 80s in Colorado, where we were wildly undersupervised. But like in 2020, like they just would not be so unsupervised, and so there's an aspect of sort of you wish you could have those kind of freedoms for kids out there. So not for every book series, but for these, I definitely was trying to build a world that I would want to live in as a kid.
For me, I think it's both. So as a child, I grew up in Ohio. I grew up at a time when there wasn't a ton of brown kids growing up near where I was. And so the monster that kind of invaded my psyche was racism. And in my book, the monster that crashes into Kieran Mala's kitchen, chapter 2, is a rock kush, is this like toothy, drooly, cannibalistic rhyming creature. And so even though, it's a metaphor, it's there. But on the other hand, I really was trying to I'm really inspired by multicultural futurists, like folks who are thinking about the ways that books create the worlds we want to live in. And so I really wanted to think forward a world that we would want to live in, a world that's already kind of dealt with a lot of oppression, and where all of us can kind of live free and justly.
I think mine is a little bit of both as well. Like Sayantani was saying, when the bad things that happen in Ghost Squad are sort of a metaphor for things that, Lucely and her father are poor, and they're at risk of being pushed out of their house, and there's gentrification happening on the more subtle scale. That's something I experienced. And then there's also wish fulfillment in terms of like probably the opposite of John, where I was only allowed to go to like the corner store and back as a kid. So I grew up in the South Bronx. So seeing like the Goonies and watching kids ride their bike like far from home, I was like, are you kidding me? Kids are allowed to do this? Obviously it was the 80s, so like it was different for me growing up a little bit after that, but but I really wanted to like, have those adventures in the book because I didn't get to do them when I was little. I couldn't go that far from home.
Let me just tell you. Yeah, I was just going to say that I grew up in the 80s and I was not allowed to like be riding around like the Goonies either. Like my immigrant parents were like, no, we want to see where you are.
Yeah, like how far was the corner store from your house? Like how far from where you live?
So it was a block. So it was a block. It was at the end of the block, but not like a full city block. It was in the Bronx. So it was maybe like, I want to say like 10 row houses down. And like my mom could like see me if she squinted, but that was as far as I was allowed to go.
Yeah, same with me. I could not leave the block. Like I had to ride to the end of the block, turn around, and just wave at everybody as they kept going.
When I was in third grade, we all got our pocket knives, we got our matches. And we were out every weekend.
That was my dream.
Once a month, we were out there. We were building snow caves, and I nearly died a couple times as a child. Like bad things happened to us as kids, but that's just how it was.
That's a fun childhood.
Sort of capture a little of that spirit too.
I want to almost die. Like, come on now. What is that?
I mean,
I want that memory.
I got through that, so I can get through the next thing. So some of those moments are really reflected in the book. So like he goes through stuff I went through, and it was scary, but you made it through.
Well, on that subject, I have 8 questions here about the same thing, so I have to ask it, even though I hate asking this question, as you'll see, because it's about rules, which I hate. But people want to know, how do you make your rules for your world? Because the reason I hate the question is because I don't think of them as rules. I just sort of make the world, and then little things happen along the way that become the boundaries. How do you think of rules in the context of making a world?
I mean, some of them are just make sense. Like I'm not going to change, gravity. You know what I mean? So if we keeping basic things the same, like there's a sun. I don't change the day-night cycle. I don't change gravity. Or weather patterns or stuff like that, unless there's something super super specific that helps the story along. Like obviously the sea, water can't burn unless, there's like oil or something on top of it. But if I change that subtly, and that's the one difference between, or one of the differences between that world and our world, suddenly, it stands out more and it means something. It's relevant. They're like, well, why is the sea burning? And it adds to this metaphor of what Tristan is going through as he's moving through this story. So it's like, I don't make up a rule until I actually like need it in the story. Like if I don't need it, I'm not, I'm not worried about, what's, do we have time zones or anything like that. It's just, if I need it, then I'll try and work through it. Otherwise it's just, I'll let your imagination fill in the blanks.
I do about the same thing. I think the only time that I ever really think about rules ahead of time is when it comes to a character's magical ability, because I don't want them to be like so powerful that like nothing can stop them. And I always think about them in like video game form, or like if they were a character in Super Smash Bros, like would other characters be able to beat them or not? So I have to give them some sort of like something to hold them back so that they can't just solve every single problem. Otherwise there's no plot.
I mean, there's a few things that happened in my book that in retrospect, I understand why I made the rules that way. But in the moment, I thought I was just being whimsical. Like, so for instance, in The Kingdom Beyond, 7 Oceans and 13 Rivers, which is where, the fantasy world where my books are set, land masses move, and they move unexpectedly. And so there are certain zones that are like no-fly zones, flying horses can't fly in these areas, because if you're caught in the air while the land is moving, it could be bad news for you, right? And so you have to have these magical maps so you can figure out, where the land masses are moving. And at the time I was doing it, my son was obsessed with maps, and we had maps all over the place, and everything we did had to do with maps. And so I had maps in my brain, and that's why I thought I was writing it out of whimsy. And it was only once I wrote it, and in retrospect, my editor said to me, oh, well, obviously this is a metaphor for the South Asian partition and the fact that people didn't know, literally what country they were in when the British left and kind of divided up the continent. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I was writing. In retrospect, probably, but like at the time, there's stories and stories and stories and layers inside of us, and sometimes we're tapping into stories without realizing it, I think.
Yeah. I think whenever people ask about rules, they're really kind of falling back to expectations. It's sort of like, what are the expectations you're giving to the reader for what's going to happen in your world? And a lot of times you can get some stuff for free just based on the genre you're in. So if you're doing vampire fiction, we just have expectations about what happens, how vampires work. And so, we don't have to, Kwame doesn't have to start from scratch by like, this is what vampires are and this is what they can and can't do. Just if you're changing any of the rules, like, oh, they can be in daylight and they sparkle a lot. Okay, well, that's an important distinction. But everything else you sort of get for free because they're vampires. One of the things I think is so challenging about a lot of the fiction we write is that we have protagonists who are doing this stuff, but there's also a real world. And like, why is not everybody talking about this? I think back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where she's fighting a monster every week, and they finally have to ask, like, why does no one in Sunnydale acknowledge this thing? And you have to have some sort of like rule for like why everyone else in the world is not talking about this thing that is clearly special. And so every book does a certain job of like hand waving that away, just so we can enjoy the premise of the stories we're reading.
Okay, we just got a glut of questions that are all about the things that can go wrong in writing. So maybe we've been too positive. Sure. So I'm going to make a list of all the things they want to know what you would do if this happens to you, and then each of you pick something you want to address. They want to know what happens if your book is boring, what happens if your book is too confusing for readers and the world isn't making any sense and is too immersive. They want to know, what do you do if you get stuck or demotivated, and what do you do when your book is missing something or feels wrong? So
basically, like, what happens every time I sit down to write?
So maybe each of you pick one little sliver of something or an issue you often deal with, and let's see if we can help some people.
I'm going to pick stuck.
Oh,
no,
okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
You want to go?
No, you can go. Go ahead.
Okay. Because I get stuck a lot. I have a full-time job and I have children. I get distracted. And so it's a super practical piece of advice I give my students all the time, which is turn on, I'm making a motion like a kitchen timer, but turn on 5 minutes, 10 minutes on your phone, whatever, and tell yourself you just have to write for that amount of time. And that seems doable. So usually I'll do that with a pencil and not on a computer, because I'll just tell myself I can't lift my pencil. Even if I'm just writing, I don't know what to write. This book is confusing. Nothing is right, for those 10 minutes. And then I'll stop and I'll take a break and I'll do it again. And usually that cracks something open, or I'll do the thing I just said, which is I'll switch between media. So I'll be writing on a computer and then switch to paper, or vice versa. And sometimes either that or changing positions of where you're writing, which was a lot easier before the pandemic. You could go to a cafe. Sometimes that helps me when I'm stuck.
So as someone who doesn't outline like Kwame, I often make a big mess. So I have to untangle things sometimes. So I actually do have to go back and sort of organize my plot. It's like a reverse outlining. So I'll take like note cards and I'll write what happens in each chapter and like spread them out in front of me and sort of like see what's happening in a really visual way. And that can help me sort of figure out, okay, this is why it's not working. It's taking too long to get to this place, or there's too many details in this section of I can't even fit what happens like on one note card. So that's not good because there's too much going on. And that visualization of things really helps me to like untangle it when there's stuff that's happening. And it helps me to identify like what's not actually necessary to make plot move forward. It's like, oh, they don't really have to have a dance party right now. I can completely cut that chapter. So I'm like a very visual person, so that helps me when I'm stuck in terms of things being too confusing.
I'll try to tackle like people read my book and it's a giant master that they find it's overwritten. So this is the person who wrote that question. I think sometimes, especially for newer writers, you kind of think like, well, I have to tell everything I know about everything because I'm not sure I'm ever going to write another book. So you try to cram way too much in. And the thing to remember is to just think back to the books you love to read. Think of yourself as a reader in addition to being a writer. And what you probably loved about them is sort of the characters and how the characters were going through this world. So you may be so obsessed with world building and like telling us how the whole thing works that you've forgotten to tell us, you know, who is this person, who are we following? So a lot of the books that we're writing, either they're first person or it's a very close third person, like you're sort of like over the shoulder of that character. And maybe just try writing scenes being very close to that character and what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. And that's, I think, probably going to lead to better story moments, but also a much easier experience for the reader to get into your writing because they really care about this character who's seeing this world for the first time.
I will take. I think these two are kind of similar. You know, what happens if your book is boring, and what happens if you're writing and there's something missing. I think those are a little similar. And so my answer to that is to number one, don't stop writing. Just keep finishing. Right to the end of the book, and then fall in love with revision. I think that's something that is, I think it's important for all writers, but especially for, like Claribel and myself, if we don't outline, like falling in love with the act of revision, knowing that, or having the confidence that, oh, I'm going to finish this draft and then draft 2 is going to be ridiculous. It is going to be so great. I'm going to improve it so much. Like it's falling in love with the idea of I cannot wait to finish so that I can begin again and refine it and make it even better, right? Like you hear, we complain all the time. We're like, oh, I've revised this and reread this so many times, and it can be tedious at times. But knowing that what you are, I'll just use my book as an example. There are 3 things. And Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky that did not enter the book in the first or maybe even the second draft. Number one is 2 of them are the villains. King Cotton and the Ma'afa did not make it into the very first draft of Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky. The Ma'afa came because I was reading a Zora Neale Hurston book and it mentioned that. And King Cotton came because in the before times when I could go to museums, I went to the National African American History and Culture Museum, and there's a giant display that has King Cotton written along the top. So those 2 concepts and characters came after the draft was already done, and I revised it to add them in because I felt like it added something more. It added more punch. It added more spark. And then the third and final thing I say is I kept trying to write Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky starting from chapter 1, where Tristan has just lost his boxing match, and it just didn't feel right. And I couldn't get in a groove into writing the book until I actually started from chapter 3, which is the Gun Baby break-in. Once I added Gun Baby into the story, everything stuck together, if you get the pun.
I think that's it. I think they're going to cut us off in exactly a minute. So I want to thank all of you for joining us and our amazing authors, John August. His book is the Arlo Finch series, Kwame Mbalia, the Tristan Strong series, Claribel Ortega with Ghost Squad, and Sayantani DasGupta with the Kiran Mala series. So thank you guys for joining us for another YALL Fest, and look out for all the great programming coming the next 2 days. So we'll see you guys all very soon.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Thanks for having us. Bye. Keep writing, everybody.